My brother pulled the plug on our dying dad. Best decision ever. My brother Emery calmly approached our father's life support machine and pulled the plug. Just yesterday, doctors had told us my dad was stable and looking like he should wake up. Now, 20 family members were watching in horror as the machines went silent and Dad's chest stopped rising. My mother screamed and collapsed while my aunts called security and my uncles pinned Emery against the wall. "You killed him!" Mom sobbed, pounding Emery's chest. "Why?" Security arrived with police backup. Emery didn't resist as they cuffed him. He just kept saying, "Check his DNA. Please, just check his DNA." The doctors managed to restart Dad's heart after 4 minutes without oxygen. His brain activity was minimal but present. They said now he'll likely never wake up properly. Mom banned Emery from the hospital while he awaited attempted murder charges. But Emery's words haunted me. He'd been acting strange ever since Dad's car accident 3 weeks ago, spending hours at the hospital records room, meeting with lawyers, making mysterious phone calls. I decided to honor his request. I ordered a DNA test using Dad's blood sample from the hospital lab. When the results came back, I was even more confused. It stung to find out this man wasn't our real father. But still, why kill him when he'd raised us for over 20 years? I confronted Emery at his arraignment. "Okay, so he's not our real dad. Who is he? And why kill him?" "I don't know who he is," Emery whispered. "But as to why I killed him," he paused, "because I found something else. Dad's medical records before the accident show type O blood. This man is type AB. Dad had surgery scars on his abdomen. Remember? This man in the hospital bed has no scars. Are you saying Dad has an evil twin or something?" "No, God number." He paused. I said, "Maybe the records were wrong." "I found Dad's real medical files hidden in the basement," he interrupted. "Recent x-rays from his physical 6 months ago. This man had different bone structure, different dental work." My mind was spinning. So they're not the same person. Still, why kill him? "The night of the accident," Emery started, "I was checking traffic cams. Dad's car went into the river at 8:56 p.m. This man was admitted at 9:15 p.m. But here's the thing. Dad called Mom at 9:03 p.m. saying he was okay, just shaken up. So for 19 minutes, someone had Dad, the real Dad. They still have him now. But why would someone pretend to be our dad on life support? We hired a private investigator with Emery out on bail. What we found destroyed everything we thought we knew. The man in the hospital bed was Viktor Kozlov, a Russian operative who'd been studying our father for 2 years. He had plastic surgery to look like him, learned his mannerisms, his voice, his memories from social media and public records. But why? Our dad was just an accountant, until we checked his client list. 3 of his clients were Defense Department contractors. Viktor had been using Dad's access to their financial systems to map money flows for classified projects. He'd already transferred millions in government funds to offshore accounts. The FBI got involved. They found Viktor's handler had been living next door to us for 3 years as Mrs. Donnellan, the sweet widow who brought us cookies. She'd been recording everything, learning our routines. But here's what made me vomit. They found evidence in Mrs. Donnellan's house that she'd been drugging Mom's coffee during their weekly visits. Memory-affecting drugs that made Mom pliable, confused. That's why she didn't notice the differences in Dad. Emery pulling the plug had forced Viktor into critical condition where he couldn't maintain his cover. The stress of life support failure made his facial implants shift. His fingerprints didn't match Dad's from his military service. Everything unraveled. The FBI showed us satellite footage from the night of the accident. A van pulling Dad's car from the river at a remote location. Dad being dragged out, alive but unconscious. The van driving toward the Canadian border. "Is he still alive?" Mom asked, suddenly sober for the first time in weeks. The agent looked uncomfortable. "We believe so. This type of operation requires long-term intelligence extraction. They'd keep him alive to verify the information Viktor was sending." "What does this extraction entail?" The agent looked down at the ground. "We have reason to suspect your father is currently being tortured." Our faces turned pale. The agent stepped back and gave us space to process what he just said, and I watched Mom's knuckles turn white where she gripped my arm. Emery leaned against the wall looking like he might be sick right there in the hospital hallway, and I realized we were all picturing the same terrible things about what torture actually meant for Dad. The agent cleared his throat after a minute and explained they needed to set up a family briefing for tomorrow morning at the FBI field office, where they could walk us through what they knew about extraction operations and what came next. Mom nodded without really hearing him, and Emery pushed off the wall and walked toward the exit without saying anything to anyone. That night I couldn't sleep, and apparently neither could Mom or Emery, because we all ended up in Mom's kitchen at 3 in the morning. I made coffee even though none of us needed more caffeine, and we sat around the table not talking and not looking at each other. Emery kept opening his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closing it again and staring at his hands. The kitchen clock ticked so loud it made my teeth hurt, and I watched the coffee get cold in our cups because none of us actually wanted to drink it. Mom finally broke the silence by asking if we thought Dad would still be the same person after everything they might be doing to him, and the question hung in the air because none of us had an answer. The FBI briefing happened in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and cleaning products, and someone had the air conditioning turned up so high I could see Mom shivering. Agent Isaiah Coleman stood at the front with a laptop and started walking us through what they knew about extraction and interrogation operations, using words like enhanced techniques and intelligence gathering protocols that made my stomach turn. I had to leave twice to throw up in the bathroom down the hall, and the second time Emery came with me and stood outside the stall not saying anything. Coleman explained that Dad likely had value as long as he could verify the financial information Victor had been sending, which meant they were probably keeping him alive and conscious. The way he said conscious made it clear that might not be a good thing, and I saw Mom close her eyes and grip the arms of her chair. After the briefing ended, Emery's bail officer showed up in the parking lot to remind him about his conditions. The man pulled out paperwork and went through all the restrictions about how Emery couldn't leave the county or contact anyone connected to the case without written permission from the court. The rules felt stupid and pointless given what we just learned about Dad being held somewhere and tortured, but Emery just nodded and signed where the officer pointed. I watched my brother's jaw muscles working as he wrote his name, and I could see him fighting to stay calm and follow the rules when every part of him wanted to do something, anything, to help Dad. The bail officer drove away, and Emery stood there in the parking lot staring at nothing, and I didn't know what to say to make any of it better. Mom asked the agents if she could see Victor one more time before they moved him to a secure medical facility, and Coleman and his partner exchanged looks before agreeing. We drove to the hospital together in silence, and walking through those doors knowing what we knew now made everything feel different and wrong. The nurses nodded at us like we were still just a normal family visiting a sick relative, and I wanted to scream at them that nothing about this was normal. Victor lay in the bed with machines breathing for him, and seeing him there knowing what he did and who he really was made my skin crawl like bugs were walking on it. Mom stood at the foot of the bed and stared at him for 5 full minutes without moving or speaking, and then she turned and walked out without looking back. Back at home, we found that our house had been searched by the FBI as part of their investigation into Mrs. O'Donnell's surveillance operation. Everything was technically where it should be, but drawers weren't quite closed all the way, and cabinet doors sat slightly crooked. The whole place felt violated and wrong, like someone had gone through our private things and touched everything. Mom went to make coffee out of habit and discovered they had taken all her coffee mugs for testing, and she started crying because those mugs were wedding gifts from Dad's mother who died 2 years ago. I found her sitting on the kitchen floor with her face in her hands, and Emery and I sat down on either side of her, and we stayed there for a long time not talking. I decided we needed help from someone who knew how to handle situations like this, so I started calling private investigators from a list I found online. Most of them said they didn't work intelligence cases, or gave me numbers for other people who might help. I called 17 different offices before I found Judith Coleman, who specialized in missing persons cases, and said she had worked with families dealing with intelligence operations before. Her voice on the phone was steady and calm, not shocked or scared by anything I told her, which was exactly what we needed right now. She agreed to meet us the next day, and warned that her services weren't cheap, but I didn't care about money when Dad was out there somewhere. I gave her our address and hung up, feeling like maybe we were finally doing something useful, instead of just waiting for other people to fix everything. Judith showed up the next morning with her sister Marilyn, who worked as a forensic accountant and carried 3 huge binders full of papers. They sat down at our dining room table and immediately started asking detailed questions about Dad's work and his clients, writing down everything we said in neat columns. Marilyn spread papers across the whole table and began drawing lines between Dad's contractor clients and what she called known intelligence targets, using different colored pens to mark different types of connections. Watching them work gave me the first real sense of forward movement I had felt since this whole thing started, and I saw some of the tension leave Mom's shoulders as she answered their questions. They asked about Dad's routines, his concerns, anything he might have mentioned about work problems, and we told them everything we could remember. Marilyn discovered something in Dad's notes that made her stop and call us over to look. She had found references to several suspicious transactions that Dad had flagged in his personal files months before the accident happened, but he never reported them through official channels. She thought he might have been running his own quiet investigation, which would explain why he became a target in the first place. The realization that Dad knew something was wrong and didn't tell us about it hurt in a new and different way, and I wondered if he was trying to protect us, or if he just didn't know who to trust. Mom asked why he wouldn't have gone to the authorities, and Marilyn said that if he suspected someone inside the system was involved, reporting it officially could have tipped them off. We sat there looking at Dad's handwriting on those notes and trying to understand what he was thinking in those last weeks before they took him. Agent Coleman called while we were still going through the papers, and I answered on speaker so everyone could hear. He said they had confirmed that Mrs. O'Donnell fled the country and was probably back in Russia by now, where extradition was impossible because of political issues between the governments. The news hit me like someone punched me in the stomach, because it meant one of the main people who planned this whole thing would never face any consequences for what they did to our family. Emery stood up so fast his chair fell over, grabbed his coffee mug and threw it against the kitchen wall where it shattered into pieces. Nobody told him to stop or clean it up, and we all just sat there looking at the broken pieces on the floor, while Coleman kept talking about international law and jurisdiction issues that didn't matter, because Mrs. O'Donnell was gone and Dad was still out there somewhere being hurt. Judith showed up the next morning and said we needed to search Dad's home office before the FBI came back for another pass. She brought boxes and labels and started pulling files off shelves, while Marilyn set up her laptop on Dad's desk to scan documents. I opened Dad's filing cabinet and found folders organized by client and date, everything neat and careful like he always kept things. Emery took the bookshelf and started checking behind books for anything hidden, and Mom sat in Dad's chair just watching us take apart his space. 3 hours in, I found a small notebook wedged behind the bottom drawer of Dad's desk, the kind with a black cover that he used to carry in his jacket pocket. I opened it and saw his handwriting listing dates and times, notes about cars he didn't recognize parked on our street, times he felt like someone was following him to work. One entry from 2 months before the accident said he thought his office had been searched because papers were in slightly different positions. Reading his words about the fear he must have felt made my hands shake, and I had to sit down on the floor because my legs wouldn't hold me up anymore. Mom came over and took the notebook from me, reading through the entries with tears running down her face, and Judith photographed every page before we turned it over to Coleman. Francisco Harden called 3 days later and asked us to come to his office downtown to discuss Victor's case. We sat in a conference room with fake wood paneling, and he explained that even though Victor would probably never wake up properly, they were building conspiracy charges based on everything that happened before Emery pulled the plug. He talked about international intelligence law and jurisdictional issues, and I could tell he was frustrated by how complicated everything was getting with multiple agencies involved. His wife Bethany came in near the end of the meeting and said she specialized in trauma therapy and wanted to offer our family sessions for free because she understood how hard this must be. Mom accepted immediately, like she'd been waiting for someone to offer help, and we scheduled our first appointment for the following week. Francisco shook our hands and said he'd keep us updated on the case progress and walking out. I felt like maybe we had some people on our side who actually cared about what happened to us. Bethany's office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs, nothing like the hospital rooms we'd been spending so much time in. Our first session was harder than I expected because she asked practical questions about bills and groceries and whether Mom could manage the house alone. I admitted I'd been sleeping on Mom's couch every night for the past 2 weeks because I was scared to leave her by herself. Emery sat forward in his chair and told Bethany he kept having thoughts about finding the people who took Dad and what he'd do to them if he got the chance. She listened without judging and then asked if we'd talked about what we'd do if Dad came home different from he was before, damaged in ways we couldn't fix. Nobody wanted to answer that question, and we sat in silence for almost a minute before Mom said we'd face whatever came as a family. Bethany gave us homework about establishing routines and taking care of ourselves, and I left feeling exhausted, but also like maybe talking about this stuff wasn't completely useless. Judith called while we were driving home from therapy and said she'd identified 3 possible locations where Dad might be held. She'd used the satellite footage and cross-referenced it with known patterns from Russian intelligence operations, and she had addresses for properties near the Canadian border that fit the profile. I put her on speaker so Emery and Mom could hear, and we all got excited until Coleman called back an hour later. He thanked Judith for the information but made it very clear that the FBI would handle any field operations, and our family needed to stay completely away from those locations. The dismissal stung because we wanted to do something active instead of just waiting, but I understood they couldn't have civilians running around potentially dangerous sites. Emery punched the dashboard and Mom told him to stop, and we drove the rest of the way home in tense silence. 2 days later, a package showed up on our front porch with no return address. Mom opened it before I could stop her, and inside was Dad's wedding ring, the one with the inscription we'd had engraved for their 20th anniversary. There was also a typed note on plain white paper that said we should stop investigating and accept the insurance settlement if we wanted to see Dad alive again. Mom grabbed the ring and held it so tight her knuckles turned white and she wouldn't let go even when Coleman showed up to take it as evidence. He put the whole package in a plastic bag and said they'd analyze it for prints and DNA, but we all knew what it really meant. Someone was watching us, knew where we lived, could reach us whenever they wanted. That night I checked all the locks 3 times and still couldn't sleep. Emery's preliminary hearing happened on a cold morning in late October. His lawyer stood up and argued that Emery's actions, while illegal, had exposed a major security breach and saved the government from ongoing intelligence losses. The prosecutor didn't fight too hard, and the judge seemed sympathetic when he talked about the unusual circumstances. They bound Emery over for trial, but reduced the charges to interfering with medical equipment instead of attempted murder. Walking out of the courthouse, Emery stopped on the steps and told me he'd do it all again exactly the same way if he had to. I believed him, and that scared me a little because it meant he'd keep taking risks if he thought it would help find Dad. Marilyn came to the house the next week with a huge binder full of financial documents and said she'd found something big. She spread papers across the dining room table and showed us how Victor had been moving money from Dad's contractor clients to offshore accounts for almost 18 months before the accident. The amounts made me feel sick. Over $40 million in total, all from classified project funds. She'd traced the transfers through multiple shell companies and dummy accounts, building a complete map of where the money went. Coleman came over that afternoon to review her findings and admitted this was bigger than they'd initially thought, that multiple federal agencies were now involved. He looked tired and said the case kept growing in ways that made it harder to focus on finding Dad, which was the only thing we actually cared about. A man from the Department of Defense showed up at our door 3 days later without any warning. He said his name was Leroy Murphy and he needed to talk to us about national security concerns related to our case. He sat in our living room and strongly suggested we sign papers agreeing not to discuss anything we'd learned about the investigation. He was polite, but I could hear the threat underneath everything he said, the implication that government interests were more important than our family emergency. I told him we needed time to think about it and talk to our lawyer, which made his jaw tighten. He stood up and said he'd give us 1 week to decide, then left his card on the coffee table and walked out. Judith arranged for us to meet with a lawyer who specialized in intelligence cases and family rights. The lawyer had an office in a tall building downtown, and she spent 2 hours explaining what we could and couldn't do legally. She said we couldn't interfere with classified operations or access restricted information, but we had legal standing to pursue our own private investigation into Dad's disappearance. She helped us understand which lines we absolutely couldn't cross versus which areas remained open to us, and she said she'd review any settlement or NDA before we signed anything. Having clear boundaries actually helped because at least we knew what we were working with instead of just guessing. Mom's neurologist appointment was scheduled for early November. The doctor ran tests on her memory and cognitive function, checking for damage from months of being drugged by Mrs. O'Donnellin. He found evidence of short-term memory problems and some mental fog, but he said most effects should get better with time and proper treatment. Mom cried with relief when he told her the damage probably wasn't permanent, but then she got angry talking about the months of her life that were stolen from her. She asked how long until she felt normal again, and the doctor said maybe 6 months to a year, which seemed impossibly long. Driving home, Mom said she felt stupid for not noticing something was wrong sooner, and I reminded her that the drugs made it impossible to notice anything. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't really believe me yet. Bethany scheduled her first one-on-one session with Mom 3 days later at her office downtown. I drove Mom there because she still felt fuzzy sometimes and didn't trust herself behind the wheel. The waiting room had soft chairs and calm paintings on the walls, the kind of place designed to make people feel safe. Mom went in alone, and I sat there for an hour reading magazines without actually seeing the words. When she came out, her eyes were red, but her face looked different somehow, like she'd let something heavy drop for a minute. She didn't talk much on the drive home, and I didn't push. That night at dinner, she mentioned that Bethany had asked her to write down every time she felt stupid about not noticing Victor wasn't Dad, and Mom said the list was already 2 pages long. Over the next few weeks, Mom went to see Bethany twice a week, and slowly she started talking about the sessions without me having to ask. She told me about how Bethany explained that the drugs made her brain literally unable to process the differences, that it wasn't about being smart or paying attention. Mom said she understood that in her head, but her heart still felt like she'd failed us somehow. The guilt sat on her like a weight she couldn't put down no matter how many times we told her it wasn't her fault. Agent Coleman called me on a Tuesday morning while I was making coffee. He said they'd arrested 2 people who worked at the hospital, a nurse and someone from the records department. One of them was talking and giving details about how they helped get Victor into the system as Dad. The nurse had been the one to make sure Victor got assigned to the right room, and the records person had altered files to match Victor's fake identity. Coleman said they'd been paid a lot of money through offshore accounts and didn't know the full scope of what they were helping with. When I told Mom about the arrest she got, so angry I thought she might break something. She kept saying how she'd trusted those people, how they'd smiled at her and brought Dad his meals and checked his vital signs while knowing the whole time he was a fake. Her hands shook when she talked about it, and I realized this betrayal hit different from the others, because these were people who were supposed to help sick people, not participate in kidnapping and espionage. She wanted to know their names, but Coleman wouldn't tell us yet because of the ongoing investigation. The hospital's legal team contacted our lawyer the following week asking for a meeting. We sat in a conference room at their main office with 3 lawyers in expensive suits across from us. They spent 20 minutes talking about how seriously the hospital took security and patient safety, how they were cooperating fully with law enforcement. Then they got to the real point, which was protecting the hospital from liability. They offered us $200,000 to sign papers saying we wouldn't sue them for negligence or anything related to Victor's infiltration. Our lawyer didn't even let us respond before she said we needed time to discuss it privately. Outside in the parking lot, she told us the offer was insulting given what happened, and that the hospital clearly knew they were in serious legal trouble. She said we should reject it and prepare for a real fight because they had insurance that could pay way more, and they needed to be held responsible for their failures. Mom agreed immediately, and said she wanted them to admit publicly that their systems failed and put our family in danger. I felt good about the decision, even though I knew it meant months or years of legal battles ahead. Judith called me that same evening, sounding excited but trying to stay calm. She said one of her intelligence community contacts had flagged a rural warehouse property about 40 miles outside the city. The property had suspicious activity patterns and matched profiles for safe house operations. She'd already shared the information with Agent Coleman, and he'd told her very firmly to stay completely away from it. She sounded frustrated when she told me this because she wanted to check it out herself, but understood the legal and safety issues. That night, Emery came over to the house and asked if I thought we should drive out there and look around. I could see in his eyes that he was serious, and I had to remind him about his bail conditions, and how getting arrested again wouldn't help Dad. He argued that we could just drive past, not get out of the car or anything. I told him no, because I knew how these things went, and driving past would turn into parking down the road, which would turn into walking closer for a better look. He finally agreed, but I could tell he was struggling with feeling powerless while Dad was out there somewhere. I promised him we'd find another way to help that wouldn't land him back in jail. My phone rang 2 days later from a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said her name was Macy, and she was Leroy Murphy's assistant. She said she had information about the DOD's internal investigation that we needed to know. Her voice sounded nervous, and she kept pausing like she was checking to make sure no one could hear her. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop across town the next morning. I got there early and sat in a corner booth where I could see the door. Macy showed up 10 minutes late looking around like she expected someone to follow her. She was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back tight. She sat down and immediately started talking in a low voice about how Leroy was more concerned with covering up the security breach than finding Dad. She said the DoD's priority was protecting their systems and their reputation, not helping our family. She told me she had kids and couldn't stay quiet about what was happening even though talking to us could cost her job. I asked why she was risking so much and she said because someone needed to stand up and her bosses clearly weren't going to do it. Macy pulled out a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. Inside were documents showing that the DoD had identified suspicious financial patterns in Dad's contractor accounts almost 6 months before the accident. They'd flagged the activity as potentially concerning, but never acted on it or warned Dad. The negligence was right there in black and white, proof that they could have prevented everything if they'd just done their jobs. Macy explained that the higher-ups had been too worried about causing problems with the contractors to investigate properly. I asked her again why she was helping us, and she said because someone should and her bosses clearly wouldn't. She made me promise not to tell anyone where the documents came from until she figured out how to protect herself. I thanked her and she left quickly, looking over her shoulder the whole way to her car. We took the documents straight to Francisco Hardin's office. His secretary said he was in meetings all day, but when I told her it was urgent, she made a call and he came out 5 minutes later. We sat in his office and spread the papers across his desk. He read through everything carefully, his expression getting darker as he went. When he finished, he sat back and said this revealed serious institutional failures that went beyond the criminal conspiracy. He promised to pursue the DoD's negligence as part of the broader case, but warned us that getting accountability from a government agency was notoriously difficult. They had lawyers and bureaucracy and national security arguments they could hide behind. Still, he said having these documents gave us leverage we didn't have before. Having someone in the prosecutor's office willing to push back against the DoD felt important, like maybe we had a real shot at getting some kind of justice beyond just the criminal convictions. Emery's lawyer called him the next week with news that his trial date was set for 3 months away. The lawyer sounded optimistic about getting the charges reduced to a misdemeanor given everything that had come out about Victor and the conspiracy. Emery listened to the whole explanation, and then said he didn't really care about his legal situation compared to the fact that we were no closer to finding Dad. When I talked to him later, he said he felt powerless and trapped by the bail conditions while Dad was somewhere being tortured. He kept asking what the point was of following all these rules and going through legal processes when every day that passed was another day Dad suffered. I didn't have good answers for him because I felt the same frustration, the same desperate need to do something more than just wait and trust the system. Bethany suggested during one of our family therapy sessions that we needed to establish some normal routines. She said we were all living in constant crisis mode and it was burning us out, making us less effective at actually helping. She proposed family dinners twice a week where we tried not to talk about the case for at least an hour. Mom looked skeptical but agreed to try it. That first dinner was incredibly hard, sitting around the table trying to have normal conversation while Dad was missing and everything was falling apart. Emery kept starting sentences about the investigation and catching himself. I talked about a book I was reading and it felt fake and hollow. But we kept at it, and by the third dinner it got a little easier. Those moments of almost normal conversation became important anchors, reminders that we were still a family and still had things beyond this nightmare. We weren't good at it, and sometimes we failed completely, and spent the whole dinner talking about leads and legal strategies, but trying mattered. Judith reported back about the warehouse property after 2 weeks of surveillance. She'd been watching from a distance with binoculars and a camera, documenting vehicle patterns and activity times. She said the regular activity was consistent with a safe house operation, but she couldn't get close enough to confirm anything without risking exposure. Agent Coleman confirmed the FBI had the location under watch, but wouldn't share any operational details with us. He said they were building a case and gathering intelligence, but couldn't move until they had solid evidence and a tactical plan. The waiting felt like its own kind of torture, knowing Dad might be that close, but not being able to do anything about it. Every day that passed without news was another day of not knowing if he was still alive or what condition he was in. I started having trouble sleeping because every time I closed my eyes, I imagined what might be happening to him. One night around 2 a.m, I gave up trying to sleep and went downstairs for water. The living room lamp was on, and I found Mom sitting on the floor surrounded by photo albums, tissues crumpled around her like snow. She had pictures spread across the carpet in some pattern only she understood, studying each one like it held secrets. I sat down next to her without saying anything, and she pointed at a photo from 5 years ago showing Dad at my college graduation. She asked me if I remembered him crying during the ceremony, and I said yes. Of course I remembered. She nodded and picked up another photo from a family vacation, asking if I could confirm specific details about that trip. We spent 2 hours going through albums together while she tested her memories against mine, trying to figure out what was real versus what Victor had performed during his time pretending to be Dad. Some memories she had were definitely from before the switch, and some were probably Victor, but sorting them out felt impossible and painful. She kept apologizing for not noticing the differences, and I kept telling her the drugs made that impossible, but she couldn't let go of the guilt. By 4 a.m, we had gone through 6 albums and reclaimed dozens of real memories about Dad. Small moments that proved our family history existed before the conspiracy destroyed everything. The next afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a journalist from a big national news outlet and said he wanted to interview us about our family's spy thriller drama. The casual way he said spy thriller drama like this was entertainment made my face hot with anger. He started asking questions about how it felt to discover our father was replaced by a Russian operative and whether we'd consider doing an exclusive interview. I told him to never contact any of us again and hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking because someone had leaked information to the press, and now our nightmare was becoming a story for strangers to consume with their morning coffee. Agent Coleman called me 2 hours later saying they were investigating the leak and trying to contain the damage, but I could tell from his voice that the information was already spreading. He warned that we might get more calls from reporters and said we should refuse all interviews and direct everyone to the FBI's press office. The idea that people would read about Dad's torture like it was just another news story made me want to throw my phone against the wall. Marilyn called that same week asking us to come to her office because she had finished analyzing all of Dad's financial records. We drove over and found her workspace covered in printouts and spreadsheets with highlighted sections everywhere. She explained that while going through Dad's computer, she had found encrypted files hidden in a folder disguised as old tax returns. Inside those files were detailed notes Dad had written about suspicious transactions he noticed in his clients' accounts, specific amounts that didn't match up with the contracts he had on file. He had been building his own case file for months, documenting patterns and concerns, copying documents he thought might be important later. Marilyn showed us pages where Dad wrote about feeling watched and not knowing who to trust with his suspicions. Reading his handwriting describing his growing fear broke something loose in my chest, and I had to step outside for a minute. When I came back in, Marilyn was showing Emery a timeline Dad had created linking the suspicious transactions to specific dates and people. He had been so close to figuring out the conspiracy, but he didn't know the danger he was in until it was too late. We took all of Dad's encrypted files to Agent Coleman the next day and watched him read through everything with his team. He admitted the files provided crucial evidence about the timeline and scope of the operation that they didn't have before. Then he looked at us and said that Dad's instincts were completely correct, and he likely became a target specifically because he was getting too close to exposing the scheme. The people running the operation realized Dad was building a case, and they moved fast to replace him with Victor before he could report anything. Agent Coleman said the notes showed Dad was probably days away from contacting the FBI when the accident happened. Knowing that Dad saw danger coming, but couldn't stop it, made everything feel worse somehow. If he had just called the FBI 1 week earlier, or if he had told us what he suspected, maybe none of this would have happened. Mom asked if Dad's investigation was why they were torturing him now, and Agent Coleman said probably yes. They were trying to find out how much he had discovered and who else he might have told. Emery had a therapy session with Bethany later that week, and it went bad. He called me afterward sounding wrecked and said he had broken down during the session about guilt over pulling the plug on Victor. Even though his actions exposed the conspiracy and probably saved the government millions more in stolen funds, he couldn't stop thinking about whether the people holding Dad punished him for the operation being blown. Bethany had tried to work with him on separating what he could control from what he couldn't, but Emery said he kept imagining Dad being hurt worse because of what he did in that hospital room. I didn't know what to say to make it better because I had the same fears sometimes. We talked for an hour, and I reminded him that he couldn't have known pulling the plug would expose everything. He was just trying to stop an imposter from stealing our father's identity. He said he knew that logically, but his brain wouldn't stop creating horrible scenarios about consequences. Before we hung up, he made me promise that if we ever found Dad and he was angry about what happened, I would explain that Emery was trying to help. Mom surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to file a civil lawsuit against the hospital for their role in the conspiracy. Our lawyer warned her it would be a long and difficult process with no guarantee of winning, but Mom said she needed to do something active instead of just waiting for other people to solve everything. She was tired of feeling helpless and wanted to fight back against the institution that allowed Victor to be inserted into our lives. The lawyer explained that proving the hospital's negligence would require showing they failed to properly verify patient identity and screen employees involved in the conspiracy. Mom said she didn't care how hard it was. She needed to hold someone accountable for what happened to our family. Watching her reclaim her agency and choose to fight gave me hope that she was going to be okay eventually. She had spent so long being drugged and confused, and now she was angry in a way that felt healthy and strong. Emery and I both supported her decision even though we knew the lawsuit would drag on for years and cost money we didn't really have. Judith got contacted by someone claiming to have information about Dad's location, and she set up a meeting at a coffee shop downtown. We all went together because we were desperate for any lead that might help find him. The guy showed up looking nervous and started telling this elaborate story about seeing someone matching Dad's description at a rest stop near the border. He said he could provide more details and help us locate the exact place, but he needed money first to cover his expenses and time. Judith asked specific questions that poked holes in his story within 5 minutes, and it became obvious he was trying to scam us. The disappointment hit me harder than I expected because some part of me had been hoping this would be real, that we would finally get solid information about where Dad was being held. Judith handled the situation professionally and told the guy to leave before she reported him to the police. After he left, she called Agent Coleman to document the attempted scam in case it was connected to the larger conspiracy. I went home and cried for an hour because the false hope had felt so real for a minute, and losing it hurt worse than not having hope at all. Agent Coleman brought us another update 2 weeks later, and the news was devastating. They had intercepted communication suggesting Dad was moved to a new location, possibly out of the country entirely. He explained that if Dad left the country, the extraction would become exponentially more complicated, because they would need cooperation from foreign governments and international agencies. He was honest with us in a way that hurt, saying the chances of a successful rescue operation were decreasing as time passed. The longer Dad stayed in captivity, the harder it would be to find him, and the more dangerous any rescue attempt would become. Mom asked if they were still actively searching, and Agent Coleman said yes, but they had to be careful about how they pursued leads, because one wrong move could get Dad killed. The waiting felt impossible, knowing that every day that passed made things worse. I wanted to scream at someone to just do something, to stop being so careful and go get him, but I understood that rushing could end with Dad dead. I started having panic attacks a few days after that meeting. They would hit without warning, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My chest would get tight and my brain would fill with horrible images of what Dad might be going through. I called Bethany after the third attack, and she added me to her client list for individual therapy. During our first session, she taught me grounding techniques like focusing on 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear. She explained that my brain was trying to protect me from uncertainty by imagining worst-case scenarios. Like if I pictured the worst possible outcomes, then maybe they wouldn't hurt as much if they happened. The sessions helped me manage the attacks better, but they couldn't change the reality that Dad was out there somewhere suffering, and we couldn't reach him. Bethany said it was normal to feel helpless in situations like this where we had no control over what happened. She warned me that the panic attacks might get worse before they got better, and gave me her emergency number in case I needed help outside our scheduled appointments. Our lawyer got a call from Gustav Roach saying he wanted to provide testimony about the operation, and how extensively Victor was altered to impersonate Dad. His wife Milena had helped him document everything because she was uncomfortable with the whole situation from the start. They kept detailed records of every surgery, every procedure, every change they made to Victor's face and body to make him look like our father. Gustav said he knew what he was doing was wrong, but he was being paid an enormous amount of money, and he convinced himself it was for intelligence purposes that served some greater good. Now that everything had gone bad, he wanted to cooperate fully and provide evidence that would help convict the people who organized the conspiracy. Their cooperation gave prosecutors crucial testimony, but it also meant hearing detailed descriptions of how much planning went into replacing Dad. Gustav's records showed that Victor spent 6 months just recovering from surgeries before he even started studying Dad's behavior and mannerisms. The level of detail and preparation was terrifying because it proved this wasn't some rushed operation. They had been planning to steal Dad's life for years. Milena brought 3 thick binders to the prosecutor's office containing photographs of Victor at different stages of the transformation. I sat across from her and Gustav while Francisco flipped through the pages, and my stomach turned seeing the progression shots. The first photos showed Victor with his original face, then post-surgery images with bandages, then healing stages where his features slowly morphed into something that looked more and more like Dad. Milena had documented every procedure with clinical precision, noting dates and techniques used. Gustav explained that Victor lived in their basement recovery suite for 6 months, because the surgeries were so extensive he couldn't risk being seen in public. They brought him meals, changed his bandages, monitored his healing. Milena's notes showed Victor spent the next year after recovery doing nothing but studying Dad. He watched hundreds of hours of video footage from Dad's social media, public events, even security camera recordings that Mrs. Donnellan had provided. He practiced Dad's handwriting for months until he could forge his signature perfectly. He listened to audio recordings of Dad's voice and worked with a dialect coach to match every inflection and speech pattern. Gustav showed us a training log where Victor tracked his progress mimicking Dad's walk, his gestures, the way he held a coffee cup. The level of detail made me feel sick because it meant Victor knew Dad better than we did in some ways. He had studied our father like a scientist examining a specimen, learning every tiny detail that made him who he was. Francisco asked how Victor learned Dad's memories and personal history, and Milena explained that Mrs. Donnellan provided detailed intelligence reports about our family going back 20 years. They had Dad's school records, employment history, medical files, everything. Victor memorized facts about Dad's childhood, his college years, his early career. He knew stories about Dad's parents and siblings, about family vacations we'd taken. Milena said Victor could answer questions about Dad's life that even we might not remember. The preparation was so thorough that Victor could have passed a polygraph test claiming to be our father because he genuinely believed the cover story after all that conditioning. Walking out of that meeting, Emery looked pale and told me he felt like throwing up. I understood because learning how they'd stolen Dad's entire identity made the violation feel even worse. 3 days later, Leroy Murphy showed up at our house without calling first. Mom answered the door and he walked in carrying a leather briefcase like he owned the place. He sat down at our kitchen table and pulled out a stack of papers, spreading them in front of us. The settlement offer from the DoD was for $2 million, and Leroy explained that accepting it would require us to sign non-disclosure agreements about everything we'd learned regarding the conspiracy. He used words like operational security and classified information, but the underlying message was clear. They wanted us to shut up and go away. Leroy said our continued investigation was creating complications for ongoing intelligence operations and putting other people at risk. He mentioned that some of the financial trails Maryland had uncovered led to active cases that could be compromised if we kept pushing. Mom asked what kind of risks we were creating, and Leroy gave vague answers about sensitive operations and national security concerns. I watched him carefully and noticed he kept checking his phone like he was nervous or expecting something. When I asked if we could think about the offer, Leroy's expression tightened. He said we had 1 week to decide, and if we chose not to accept, there might not be another offer. The threat wasn't explicit, but it hung in the air between us. After he left, Emery paced the kitchen and said there was no way we should take their money. Mom surprised me by saying maybe we should at least consider it. She looked exhausted, and I realized the stress was wearing her down in ways I hadn't fully understood. The legal bills were piling up, and Mom's medical expenses from dealing with the drug effects weren't covered by insurance. $2 million would solve a lot of practical problems, even if it meant giving up on certain kinds of justice. We scheduled a family meeting for that evening to talk through the settlement offer properly. Emery arrived early and immediately started arguing against accepting any deal that would silence us. He said Dad was still out there suffering and taking DOD money felt like abandoning him. Mom sat at the table with her hands folded and said she understood his position, but we needed to be realistic about our situation. She explained that the legal bills from Emery's case and the civil lawsuit against the hospital were draining her savings. The mortgage was behind, and she'd been borrowing money from her sister to cover basic expenses. I felt caught between them because both perspectives made sense to me. Emery's passion about not giving up on Dad was admirable, but Mom's exhaustion was real and visible. She'd been through so much with being drugged and manipulated, and now the financial pressure was crushing her. I suggested we at least talk to our lawyer before making any decision, and both of them agreed that was reasonable. Emery said he'd go along with whatever we decided as a family, but his face showed how much he hated the idea of taking DOD money. Mom thanked him for being willing to listen, and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. That small gesture reminded me that despite everything pulling us apart, we were still trying to stay connected as a family. We set up an appointment with our lawyer for 2 days later to review the settlement terms and get professional advice about what accepting would actually mean. Our lawyer spread the DOD settlement documents across her conference table and spent an hour going through the terms line by line. She pointed out that signing would prevent us from pursuing any civil action against the hospital or government agencies involved in the security failures that enabled the conspiracy. We couldn't continue our private investigation or share information with journalists or advocacy groups. The non-disclosure agreement was broad enough that we'd barely be able to discuss what happened with anyone outside immediate family. She explained that $2 million sounded like a lot of money, but it didn't come close to compensating for what we'd lost. Dad's lifetime earning potential as an accountant was worth more than that, and the emotional damages from what our family had endured couldn't be measured in dollars. The lawyer also noted that accepting the settlement would mean giving up any chance of holding the DOD accountable for their negligence in allowing the security breach to happen. She said the documents Macy had provided showed clear institutional failures that should have prevented Victor from accessing classified financial systems. By taking the money, we'd be letting them off the hook for those failures. Mom asked what would happen if we rejected the settlement, and the lawyer said we could continue pursuing our civil case and investigation, but we'd be on our own financially. The DOD had deep pockets and could drag out litigation for years. I watched Mom's face as she processed this information and saw her struggling with the weight of the decision. Our lawyer recommended we take time to think carefully before signing anything, because once we accepted, there was no going back. 2 days after the lawyer meeting, Macy called my cell phone and asked if we could meet somewhere private. I drove to a park on the edge of town and found her sitting on a bench looking nervous. She told me that Leroy was under internal investigation at the DOD for his handling of the security breach that allowed Victor to access classified systems. The investigation was looking at whether Leroy had ignored warning signs or failed to implement proper safeguards. Macy said Leroy knew the investigation was getting serious, and he was trying to clean up loose ends before everything went public. His pressure on our family to sign the settlement wasn't just about national security, it was about protecting himself from accountability. If we kept pushing and our lawyer kept digging into the DOD's institutional failures, Leroy's negligence would become part of the public record. Macy showed me internal emails on her phone where Leroy discussed strategies for containing the fallout from our case. He'd written things about managing the family's expectations and minimizing their ability to cause problems. Reading his words made me angry because it was clear he saw us as a problem to be solved, rather than victims who deserved help. Macy said she was telling me this because she couldn't stay quiet while Leroy used our family tragedy to cover his own mistakes. She knew she might get fired for leaking internal information, but she had kids of her own and couldn't live with herself if she stayed silent. I thanked her and asked if she'd be willing to share this information with Agent Coleman at the FBI. She hesitated but finally agreed, saying she'd already come this far and might as well see it through. I called Agent Coleman that afternoon and told him what Macy had revealed about Leroy's internal investigation. He asked me to come to the FBI field office the next morning and bring any documentation Macy could provide. When I arrived, Agent Coleman confirmed that the FBI was already aware of the DOD's internal problems and had been building their own case against several officials who'd failed to act on intelligence about suspicious financial patterns. He said Leroy Murphy was definitely on their radar as someone who'd shown poor judgment and possible negligence. Agent Coleman asked us not to accept the DOD settlement until their investigation concluded because taking the money would limit what the FBI could pursue in terms of institutional accountability. He couldn't promise anything specific about outcomes or compensation, but he suggested that patience might result in better results for our family in the long run. I asked how long the FBI investigation would take, and he said probably several more months at minimum. That timeline felt impossible when we were already struggling financially, but I understood that rushing into a settlement might mean giving up justice for short-term relief. I told Agent Coleman we'd discuss it as a family, and make a decision within the week like Leroy had demanded. That evening I called Mom and Emery together and explained everything Macy had revealed and what Agent Coleman had said. We talked for 2 hours about the pros and cons of waiting versus accepting the settlement. In the end, we decided to decline Leroy's offer and trust that the FBI investigation would lead somewhere better. I called Leroy the next morning and told him we weren't signing. His voice got cold and he said we were making a serious mistake that we'd regret. The threat in his tone was clear, and I realized we'd just made an enemy of someone with significant power and resources. The following week, Judith called with news that she'd found something the initial FBI investigation had missed. Mrs. O'Donnell had maintained a storage unit under a false name in a facility 30 miles outside the city. Judith had tracked it down by following a pattern of monthly payments from one of the offshore accounts Marilyn had identified. We got a warrant and met Judith at the storage facility with Agent Coleman and 2 other FBI agents. The unit was climate-controlled and packed with equipment and documents. There were surveillance cameras, listening devices, and recording equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Boxes of files contained detailed notes about our family's routines, Mom's schedule, and observations about our habits and vulnerabilities. Mrs. O'Donnell had documented everything from what time Mom went grocery shopping to which neighbors she was friendly with. One file was just about Mom's coffee drinking habits, and included notes about when and how to dose her drinks without detection. Reading those clinical observations about my mother made me feel sick. But what really shocked us was finding files about other families too. Mrs. O'Donnell and her network had been running similar operations on at least 4 other targets that we could identify from the documents. There were photographs and surveillance reports on people we didn't know, detailed plans for infiltrating their lives. Agent Coleman's team spent 6 hours cataloging everything in the storage unit, and I watched them load box after box into FBI vans. Judith explained that this evidence proved our family wasn't an isolated case, but part of a larger intelligence operation that had been running for years. The scope of it was overwhelming and made me realize how many other families might be going through something similar without even knowing it. The evidence from the storage unit led to arrests within 2 weeks. 3 more people got taken into custody, including a banker who'd helped move the stolen funds through various shell companies and accounts. Each arrest felt like a small victory, like we were finally seeing some accountability for what had been done. But none of the arrests brought us any closer to finding Dad, which was the only thing that really mattered. Francisco called to tell us that the case was becoming one of the largest intelligence-related prosecutions in years. He said the evidence we'd helped uncover was solid, and would likely result in significant prison sentences for everyone involved. The media was starting to pay attention too, which made Francisco both pleased and concerned. He wanted public accountability, but worried about the case turning into a circus that would make prosecution harder. I asked him how long the trials would take, and he estimated at least a year before everything was resolved. That timeline felt crushing because it meant living in this nightmare state for months more, waiting for justice while Dad was still missing. Emery said he didn't care about the prosecutions or convictions if they didn't help us find Dad. I understood his frustration, but tried to explain that holding people accountable mattered even if it didn't immediately solve our biggest problem. Mom stayed quiet during these conversations, and I could tell she was processing everything in her own way. Mom's therapy sessions with Bethany were happening twice a week now, and I could see changes in how she carried herself. One evening she came home from a session and seemed different, more solid somehow. She told me that Bethany had helped her understand that she needed to stop blaming herself for not recognizing Victor. The drugs Mrs. O'Donnell had been giving her had literally altered her brain chemistry and perception. Mom said she'd been carrying guilt about being stupid or blind, but Bethany made her see that she'd been a victim of chemical manipulation, not a fool who missed obvious signs. For the first time since this started, I heard real anger in Mom's voice when she talked about Mrs. O'Donnell and the people who'd drugged her. That anger felt healthy and strong compared to the confused shame she'd been showing before. Bethany had apparently told Mom that directing her anger at the actual perpetrators instead of herself was a crucial step in recovery. Over the next few weeks, I watched Mom stand straighter and speak more firmly. She started pushing back when officials tried to manage or control our family's involvement in the case. She demanded updates and information instead of passively accepting whatever they chose to share. The change was remarkable, and I realized Mom was becoming fierce in a way I'd never seen before. She'd always been kind and gentle, but now there was steel underneath that I hadn't known existed. Emery noticed it too and told me privately that he was proud of how Mom was fighting back after everything she'd been through. Emery's trial happened on a cold morning in late October. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, and we sat in the front row behind Emery's lawyer, while the prosecutor presented the case against him. The charges had been reduced to interfering with medical equipment and reckless endangerment, which was better than the attempted murder charge he'd originally faced. Emery's lawyer argued that his actions, while technically illegal, had exposed a major national security breach and potentially saved other lives by revealing the conspiracy. The prosecutor acknowledged that Emery's motives were understandable, but maintained that citizens couldn't take the law into their own hands regardless of circumstances. The judge listened to both sides and asked Emery if he had anything to say. Emery stood up and said he'd do it again exactly the same way if it meant protecting his family and exposing the truth. The judge looked at him for a long moment before pronouncing sentence: 2 years probation and 200 hours of community service. The judge called Emery's actions understandable if illegal given the extraordinary circumstances, and said he was taking into account that Emery's instincts had been correct about the imposter. Walking out of the courthouse, Emery seemed relieved more than anything. Being a convicted criminal bothered him less than I expected, and he told me he was just glad it was over so he could focus completely on finding Dad. The bail conditions were lifted, which meant Emery had more freedom to help with the investigation without checking in with officers or staying within county limits. He could travel if needed and contact whoever might have information about Dad's location. That freedom felt important because we all knew the search for Dad was far from over, and we needed every advantage we could get. 2 weeks later, Judith called with news that made my hands shake while holding the phone. A local resident near the industrial district had been tracking vehicle patterns around an abandoned warehouse property and noticed the same 3 vans showing up at odd hours, always staying less than 30 minutes before leaving again. Agent Coleman pulled together a surveillance team within hours of getting Judith's report, but he made it very clear when he came to brief us that our family could not be anywhere near the operation. We agreed because we had no choice, but that night at home trying to watch movies with Mom and Emery felt impossible. None of us could focus on the screen. Mom kept checking her phone every few minutes, even though Coleman said he would call as soon as they had anything. Emery paced between the living room and kitchen, making coffee he didn't drink and staring out windows into the darkness. I tried to read but kept going over the same paragraph without understanding any of it. Around midnight, Mom finally gave up and went to her room, but I could hear her moving around up there instead of sleeping. Emery and I stayed on the couch until almost 3 in the morning, not talking, just waiting. The call came at 7 the next morning while we were all drinking coffee in the kitchen and pretending we had slept. Coleman's voice sounded tired but controlled when he told us they had raided the warehouse at dawn. They found evidence that Dad had been held there recently, including medical supplies with his blood type and documents with his handwriting on them. My chest got tight when Coleman said the good news was Dad had been alive as of 2 weeks ago, based on the dates on the documents. Then came the bad news. The location was abandoned now, and they had moved him again, probably within the last few days. Coleman said he was sending over photos of Dad's handwriting, so we could confirm it was really his. When the images came through on my phone, I recognized Dad's familiar scrawl immediately, those specific loops on his capital letters that he had always made. Mom started crying when she saw them, not loud sobs but quiet tears running down her face while she stared at the phone screen. Seeing proof that Dad had been alive so recently, but was gone again, felt like getting punched. That afternoon, while Coleman's team was still processing the warehouse, I made a decision I knew was stupid even while I was doing it. They had found a burner phone number written on one of the documents, probably used for communication between the people holding Dad. I copied the number into my own phone and sent a message before I could talk myself out of it. I offered myself in exchange for Dad, said they could have me instead if they would just let him go. The message sent, and I stared at my phone, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. Agent Coleman found out within 2 hours because apparently they were monitoring that number. He showed up at our house angrier than I had ever seen him, his face red and his voice sharp when he told me I had potentially compromised their investigation and put myself in danger. Emery was furious too, asking me what I was thinking, and whether I had any idea what I had just done. But I could tell part of him understood the desperate impulse to do something, anything, to help Dad, instead of just sitting around waiting for other people to fix things. Coleman made me promise not to do anything like that again, and warned that if I interfered with the investigation one more time, he would have me arrested for obstruction. My message got a response 3 days later. The text came from a different number and instructed us to wire $2 million to an offshore account and stop cooperating with authorities. It said if we continued working with the FBI, we would never see Dad alive again. The demand confirmed someone was still monitoring our communications and movements, which made my skin crawl. Agent Coleman used the response to try tracking the source, but whoever sent it had used sophisticated masking technology that bounced the signal through multiple countries. His tech team spent days trying to trace it and got nowhere. The whole thing made me feel stupid and helpless, like I had made everything worse for nothing. Leroy Murphy heard about my unauthorized contact within a week and used it as ammunition when he showed up at our house again. He argued that family members were becoming liabilities to the professional operation and pushed harder for us to sign NDAS and step back from the investigation completely. Francisco Harden was there too and defended our right to be involved, but I could tell the incident had damaged our credibility with some of the officials. They looked at me differently now, like I was a problem that needed to be managed instead of a family member trying to help. The meeting got heated with Leroy and Francisco arguing while Mom sat silent and Emery clenched his jaw. Bethany scheduled an emergency session with me 2 days later to work through the guilt I was feeling about potentially making things worse with my message. She helped me understand that the impulse came from love and desperation, even if the action was unwise. We talked about how powerlessness can make people do reckless things, and she made me see that beating myself up about it was not productive. I committed to following proper channels from now on and trusting the professionals to do their jobs. But the fear that I had hurt Dad's chances of rescue haunted my dreams, waking me up at night with images of him being punished because of what I had done. Meanwhile, Marilyn kept digging through financial records, and discovered another set of offshore accounts that Victor had been funneling money into. These ones were linked to a shell company registered in Cyprus, which added another layer to the conspiracy network. She presented her findings to Francisco, who said the additional evidence would help build a stronger case against everyone involved. Each financial thread Marilyn unraveled revealed more people connected to the operation and more money stolen. The scope kept getting bigger and more complicated, which meant more agencies getting involved and more bureaucracy slowing everything down. Agent Coleman brought news about a week later that they had identified a potential location in Canada, where Dad might currently be held. The lead came from intercepted communications combined with the vehicle patterns Judith had documented at the warehouse. Coleman explained that the FBI was coordinating with Canadian authorities for a possible joint operation, but the planning would take time because of jurisdictional issues. He warned us that even if they located Dad, there was no guarantee about his condition, or whether extraction would be possible. The words hit hard, reminding us that rescue operations are not like the movies and things can go very wrong. The waiting during the Canadian operation was unbearable. We spent 3 days barely eating or sleeping, checking our phones constantly for updates. Mom stopped going to therapy appointments, and Emery stopped doing his community service hours. We just sat in the house together, drinking coffee and staring at our phones. Agent Coleman finally called on the third day, and I answered so fast I almost dropped the phone. He told us they had raided the location that morning but found it recently abandoned again. There was evidence Dad had been there, including more medical supplies and personal items, but he had been moved approximately 48 hours before they arrived. The near miss was crushing. Mom put her head down on the kitchen table and Emery punched the wall hard enough to leave a dent. We had been so close and missed him again. Through all of this, Mom's civil lawsuit against the hospital kept moving forward despite their attempts to get it dismissed. Our lawyer argued that the hospital's negligence in verifying patient identity and screening employees had enabled the entire conspiracy to happen. The hospital's insurance company started making settlement overtures, offering money if we would drop the case quietly. But Mom refused to settle until they admitted fault publicly. She wanted accountability, not just money, and she was willing to fight for it no matter how long it took. A few weeks after that conversation, Emery started his court-ordered community service at a local veteran support center. I stopped by one afternoon to check on him and found him helping an older vet fill out disability paperwork. Emery looked up when I walked in and actually smiled, which I hadn't seen him do in months. After his shift ended, we grabbed coffee at the place next door, and he told me the work was helping him deal with everything. Being around people who'd been through impossible situations and watched systems fail them gave him perspective on what our family was going through. He said one guy had spent 3 years fighting the VA for benefits he deserved, and another had lost everything because nobody believed his PTSD was real. These weren't people who gave up, and that mattered to Emery. He also admitted he'd been quietly asking around about anyone with intelligence contacts who might help us find Dad. A couple of the older vets had friends who used to work in that world, and Emery was building a list of people Judith might want to talk to. The next morning, Judith called me with actual good news for once. She'd connected with a former intelligence officer through one of Emery's veteran contacts, and the guy was willing to share information about Russian extraction protocols. We met him at a diner outside the city, and he spent 2 hours explaining how operations like the one that took Dad actually work. He said high-value targets get moved every few weeks to prevent rescue attempts, but the movements follow patterns based on available safe houses and transportation routes. He pulled out a map and started marking areas where Dad most likely was being held, explaining the logic behind each location. The information helped Judith narrow her search in ways that actually made sense, and for the first time I felt like we were working with real intelligence instead of just guessing. Agent Coleman called 3 days later saying his team had used the new information to identify 3 probable locations where Dad might be held. All of them were in remote areas near the Canadian border, which matched what the former intelligence officer had predicted. Coleman explained they were planning coordinated surveillance of all 3 sites, but organizing the operation properly would take weeks, because they needed cooperation from Canadian authorities, and had to avoid alerting whoever was holding Dad. I wanted to scream at him that weeks felt like forever when Dad was tortured, but I knew he was right that rushing would risk everything. The waiting was killing us, but messing up the operation would be worse. That night I couldn't sleep and went downstairs around 2 in the morning to get water. I saw light coming from Dad's office and found Mom sitting at his desk, going through his files again. She had his encrypted notes spread out in front of her and was reading them with this intense focus. When she noticed me in the doorway, she said she was trying to understand what he'd been thinking in those final weeks before the accident. Dad had known something was wrong but didn't know who to trust, and Mom wanted to get inside his head during that time. We sat together and talked about how alone he must have felt, watching his world get more dangerous and having nobody he could safely tell. Mom started crying and said she felt the same isolation now, like she couldn't trust her own memories or judgment anymore. I realized she was processing her own feelings of betrayal through understanding Dad's, and I just held her hand while she worked through it. The following week, Bethany asked us to come in for a family session to talk about something difficult. When we got there, she said we needed to start planning for different possible outcomes with Dad's situation. That included the hard reality that he might not survive, or might come back permanently changed by what he'd been through. Nobody wanted to have that conversation, but Bethany pushed us to think about how we'd support each other regardless of what happened. Mom said something that surprised me. She looked at both Emery and me and said that whatever condition Dad came home in, If he came home at all, we'd face it together as a family. She wasn't going to fall apart again like she had when Victor was in the hospital. We were going to be strong for Dad and for each other, no matter what that meant. 2 months later, Francisco finally got his day in court with the conspiracy case. He won convictions against 4 members of the network, including the 2 hospital employees who'd helped get Victor into the system, and the banker who'd moved all that stolen money. Victor himself was still in a persistent vegetative state, and would probably never stand trial, but seeing the others get sentenced felt like something. The hospital employees got 8 years each, and the banker got 15. Francisco told us afterward that the sentences were significant, and sent a message about consequences for this kind of betrayal. It wasn't enough to make up for what happened to Dad, but it was better than nothing. Around the same time, Macy called to tell me she'd been fired from her position at the DoD for whistleblowing. Her voice was shaky on the phone, but she said she didn't regret coming forward with what she knew about Leroy and the department's failures. She'd already found work with a government accountability nonprofit that wanted her specifically because of what she'd done. Talking to her made me feel less alone in fighting institutions that cared more about protecting themselves than doing what was right. I told her I'd stay in touch, and I meant it. She understood what it cost to stand up when everyone wanted you to sit down and be quiet. Then Agent Coleman called with the news we'd been waiting for. An international NGO worker named Alexa Kent had flagged a clinic registry in Eastern Europe with a patient matching Dad's description and medical profile. The details lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. Coleman said it was the strongest lead they'd had in months, and the FBI was already working with international partners to investigate. I told Mom and Emery immediately, and we all just stood there in the kitchen looking at each other. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, we let ourselves feel real hope. Not the desperate kind that makes you do stupid things, but the careful kind that says maybe, just maybe, we might actually find Dad alive and bring him home where he belongs.